In the 1920s, it was unthinkable to be a woman who wasn't married by the time you were in your 30s. If that was you, you'd be considered to be a spinster for life. And this was the case for 39-year-old Frances Clarke. However, she found comfort in one man who she trusted with her life. But when she then found someone else who she connected with more, someone she fell deeply in love with and eventually married, her ex-lover would come back into her life in a brutal and deadly way. And for one drunken and jealous man's actions, Frances would pay the ultimate price. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage, and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source materials I can find. You can find all episodes that are on YouTube as a podcast version wherever you get your podcasts. The man climbing the yard wall at the rear of 9 Clark Street, Bolton, at 5 a.m. on the 20th of November 1925 had a cutthroat razor in his pocket. He was finding it difficult to get over the wall, particularly because of having to navigate this with one wooden leg. But eventually he did manage to lift himself up onto the wall. He swiveled his body round and gently dropped into the backyard of the house that Frances Clarke and her husband, William, shared with Frances's mother, 71-year-old Harriet. The fog was thick, which, together with the darkness of a November morning, restricted visibility to just a few yards in the poorly lit street. Frances's husband, William, had already left for work. He worked at Little Lever Chemical Works. And before he left, he had kissed his wife and then gone out of the door. And he would never see his wife alive again. And the man standing in the backyard knew that. That man knew Frances and her husband, and he knew what time they got up, where they worked, what time they left for work, and precisely which bedroom of the house that they slept in. And Frances had fallen back to sleep in the front bedroom before she too would later get up and go to work. Outside, the man in the yard limped to the back door. A few days before, he had gone there and actually removed a pane of the window glass from the kitchen door with a glass cutter. When Frances had found this missing pane the very next day, she checked the house, but she saw that there was nothing missing. She couldn't understand why it had just disappeared, and she hadn't had chance yet to replace it. The man in the yard put his hand through the hole in the kitchen door window, turned the door key, and let himself in. Nobody in the house heard the kitchen door opening as he entered the house. It's likely nobody heard as he placed one foot inside the house, or heard the strange knock of wood on the floor as he manoeuvred his wooden leg further inside the house so that he could start to climb the stairs. Step by step, the one-legged man climbed the stairs as quietly as he could until he was standing outside of Frances's room. Out of his pocket, the intruder then pulled out a cutthroat knife and he went inside. It's likely that by this point, he wasn't trying to be particularly quiet because he was already inside by now. And as he moved towards Frances, he came to stop just next to her bed. And the next thing that was reported was a scream, and then another scream, and then another. And it is difficult to know for certain what the screams were about exactly, but at least one of those was Frances recognizing that there was a man standing over her, holding a cutthroat razor. The intruder grabbed Frances by the neck, placed the cutthroat against it, and then slit it from one side to the other with a single stroke. Blood gushed out as he severed a major artery, and with that one slice, he then turned and left the room, making his escape down the stairs and out of the house. Now, next door, Harriet jumped up when she heard Frances's scream, and she also heard a very familiar noise. The sound of that wooden leg knocking on the stairs as the intruder made a rapid escape from the house. Harriet got up and she rushed into Frances's room. Frances was still alive, but only just, as her nightdress became soaked in blood. The intruder had by now left the house and disappeared into the fog and darkness of that winter morning. And as Frances lay bleeding to death, she did manage to utter a word, and that word was Billy. Harriet knew exactly who she meant. Billy, the man with the wooden leg, was a man who would often come to see Frances. The same man had often stayed at 9 Clarke Street with Frances and her mother Harriet. Harriet rushed downstairs to the nearest phone box to call an ambulance before also calling the police. Unfortunately, however, by the time the ambulance arrived, Frances was already dead. William Henry Thorp, who was also known as Billy Thorp, was born in 1880 in Blackrod, which is a small town and at the time had around 4,000 people. It was close to Bolton. And he lived in the isolated Lark Hill farm with his mum Sarah, who was a dressmaker, and his younger sister Margaret. Sarah had died in 1898 when Billy was just 18 years old, and it's likely that after she had passed away, with Billy having no profession, he would have just left home, he would have moved out of the area and just gone around looking for work as a general labourer. Now this work was low paid, it was unskilled, and usually it was temporary. So it was very unlikely that Billy would have been able to afford any kind of home or somewhere to live. He probably would have survived by lodging in spare rooms. So we can assume that is what he did. And by the age of 30, he was living at number 458 Hassel Road in Hull, Yorkshire. Billy wasn't married, and there's no reports of him being romantically involved with anyone at this time, which actually isn't surprising given the time, given his financial situation and the way marriage worked back then. He probably would have been considered a loner. In 1914, Europe went to war and they needed men in the army to fight. But Billy was too old to enlist. He was 34. And at the start of the war, the army targeted young and unmarried men. But by 1915, there were fewer and fewer of these kinds of men available. And so they started to relax their criteria and they looked towards people who were Billy's age. And so by January 1916, the Military Service Act would be passed, and this imposed conscription on all single men between the ages of 18 and 41. And in 1915, Billy didn't really have any skills, and his day-to-day existence probably encouraged him to volunteer. Given the opportunity of a regular wage, rent-free accommodation, and 3 meals a day, it's sort of unsurprising that Billy joined the East Yorkshire Regiment based in Beverley, which is a town just to the north of where he was living. As well as the dreadful death toll, the First World War left many men without limbs, and they would suffer the life-changing effect of grades and mines and shrapnel. My great-granddad had shrapnel from his First World War injuries in his body in the 1970s at the age of 75. That shrapnel was still gradually working its way out of his body, causing him pain for the whole of his adult life, but at least he still had all of his limbs. That wasn't the case for many soldiers. Billy had lost his lower part of his left leg during the war. And amputees, no longer fit to fight, would leave the army with a fitted leg to wear, which, with the help of crutches or a walking stick, in Billy's case, actually enabled him to continue to work as a low-skilled, low-paid labourer. There was such a shortage of men for this type of work after the war that he got this job pretty easily. But it wasn't an easy job. It was difficult for him. The pay the employers were prepared to offer him was really pretty poor. So in the early 1920s, he moved back to Bolton and decided to take up the position of watchman. Watchmen in the 1920s weren't as needed because of the police force, but they were basically employed to patrol in the dark and look after poorly lit streets overnight. After dark, these streets became incredibly dangerous and people would turn out of pubs and other people would plan burglaries while people were just asleep in their beds. Watchmen were employed basically to deter criminal activity and provide law enforcement as well as public safety and fire watch. Billy's military background qualified him for this role, a role which would be very useful if he ever wanted to do some breaking and entering himself. A watchman in the street late at night, checking backyards and doors, would not be questioned. People would think that Billy was simply there to do his job. He sort of had a free ride at wherever he wanted to be at night. It was during this period in 1922 that Billy met Frances King, and he then lodged with Frances and her mum at their home. Now, at the time, Frances was unmarried and she was aged 39, so in society in the 1920s, she was considered to have missed her chance to find a suitable partner, and in the eyes of society, she'd remain a spinster for the rest of her life. But when Frances and Billy met, they formed a kind of mutual bond, and they started this on-again, off-again relationship. And that relationship developed over time. And even when Billy moved out, he would often come back and stay overnight with Frances at the house on Clarke Street. Billy's feelings towards Frances did develop, and he found himself believing that they had an unspoken bond that they meant that they would be together permanently. But this was very different for Frances. And in fact, she at this time had met a 38-year-old factory worker called William Clarke. This was in 1925, and they'd started seeing each other. And Billy got to hear about this relationship and confronted Frances, but she maintained to him that it was nothing serious, it was quite casual, and they should continue to see each other. So they did throughout July of 1925. And once again, Billy found himself staying at Clarke Street overnight occasionally. Now, whatever Frances told Billy to keep him believing that he was her preferred lover, something beyond that must have happened between them, because at some point Frances married William Clarke in August of 1925. And so William moved into the house on Clarke Street and into Frances's bedroom. Now, Billy couldn't believe this had happened. He had felt totally betrayed, and we don't know precisely what happened between Billy and Frances to cause this kind of change of heart on Frances's part. But Billy wrote Frances a letter, quote, "You are constantly in my head. I wish I had my time over again. I would have married you. It would have made me so happy, but as it is, I have made my own misery. If only I could undo what I did." So very clearly, something has happened. There's no reports on what this is, so we can only guess. We just don't know. But something had happened to cause Frances to leave Billy and decide that William was going to be her life partner. And if Billy had hoped that this letter would prompt Frances to leave her new husband to be with him, his hopes were crushed when that didn't happen. In fact, he didn't even get a reply. On the 19th of November 1925, Billy had been labouring on a building site in Bolton, and at the end of the day, he collected his wages. And after that, he took those wages and went to the tap room of the Hare and Hounds. Whilst he was there, it was likely that there was this sort of mounting resentment in him, and so he downed another pint of strong ale, followed by whiskey chasers. And after a few hours of being there, he staggered out, caught a trolley bus into the town centre, and just continued drinking. And he did that for hours and hours before finally getting the last bus back to the Hare and Hounds, where he stayed until last orders. The landlord called last orders, and Billy managed to get to the bar, and he asked for a bottle of rum that he was going to take out. He staggered back to his lodgings, and then he just continued drinking through the night until 5 the next morning. He hadn't eaten, he hadn't slept, and as dawn broke, he was now ready to carry out the plan that had been in his head for a few days. He was drunk enough to do it. And so Billy arrived at the Clarke Street, and he had already removed that glass window from the back door a few days before. So he gained easy access into the house, and of course we know he carried out the brutal murder. After that, as Billy left, he started to make his journey back to his lodgings in the darkness of this foggy night, or early hours of the morning now. And he couldn't quite believe what he had done. In a fit of drunkenness, he had just slit the throat of the only woman he had ever loved, or claimed to love. He couldn't undo what he had done, and he knew that he would be caught, he would be tried, and he would be convicted of murder, and that meant that he would be hung. He knew that everybody in the town and the county, probably even the country if this got into the nationals, would know exactly what he had done. He knew that he would be ridiculed and hated by everyone who heard about the murder of a defenseless woman in her own bed. And these thoughts were probably going through his head as he heard a tram snaking its way through the street, and as it came towards him in darkness, he launched himself in front of it, hoping that the wheels of the 30-ton tram would crush the life out of his body. But he couldn't even get that right because of the fog. The tram driver was actually travelling at a really slow pace and managed to bring the tram to a halt before it crushed Billy's body. The driver jumped out of the tram to talk to this man, but Billy had realised that the tram had stopped in time, and so he jumped up, punched the driver in the face, and then he got down from the tram and just disappeared into the night. The driver was just left on the ground nursing his bruises. And on the way home from that incident, Billy again tried to take his own life, this time by throwing himself into the canal close to where he was staying at the time. But his desire to live outweighed his desire to die, and he was actually just unable to hold his head under the water long enough, and so ultimately survived. Solving this case was not a difficult one for police. Frances's mum had the name of the murderer from the lips of the dying Frances, and she'd heard Billy making his way down the stairs, the unmistakable sound that she'd heard many times before when they'd put him up in their home. It was clear to police that Billy had entered the house and carried out the murder, and they managed to find him pretty quickly, located at his lodgings. They burst through the door and they were confronted by Billy holding a razor to his own throat. Now, he was still drunk, and so the police managed to actually disarm him, and they arrested him and took him to the local police station, where he told them, quote, "Drink is the cause of it all." They searched his lodgings and they found a blood-stained razor and a glass cutter. In custody that afternoon, Billy made another attempt to take his own life. He tried to hang himself with his braces for his clothes, and that was in the police station lavatory. But his escorting officer heard the noise coming from the cubicle and managed to kick the door in and get him down in time for him to stand trial. His trial was on the 23rd of February 1926 in Manchester, and Billy's only chance to avoid the hangman's noose was to convince the jury that he was insane at the time of the murder. Billy's defence lawyer called the son of Billy's landlady to testify. He confirmed that Billy did seem to be going off his head, that's a quote, and that he had tried to kill himself on numerous occasions. Standing in the dock, Billy looked as though he was about to collapse. He was pale and he was vacant. But he did manage to tell the court that he had first lodged with Frances and her mum in 1922, and that it was soon after that that he and Frances started having this love affair. He said he knew nothing of her relationship with William until a friend had told him about it, and he was devastated. He then tried to deny remembering anything about carrying out this murder, claiming in court that the razor police had found at his lodgings was just the razor he used for shaving and was not used to murder Frances, despite the fact that it had bloodstains on the handle. This is back in the late 1800s, so there's just no way of testing that either. He also claimed that the glass cutter that was found in his house was to fix a broken window pane at a building site he worked on, and it was nothing to do with the murder. He said he didn't know what had happened on the 19th of November because he was so drunk, and he just outright denied the charges. Before the verdict, the judge summed up for the jury, telling them that in certain cases, some people who were very drunk could be said to be suffering from a form of insanity. Quote, "We all know from said experience that drunkenness does weaken a man's self-control, and as a result, he does things he would not do when sober." Don't really need to speak on that, I don't think. The jury retired, and within 30 minutes they were back in court and they had reached a verdict of guilty of murder, but there was a strong recommendation for mercy. The judge placed a black cap on his head and pronounced that Billy was sentenced to death, and he would be taken to the place of execution and then hanged by the neck until dead. This is perhaps surprising now, but there were a huge number of people who were actually in support of Billy and completely disagreed with the sentence. They actually tried to save Billy. There were a number of petitions asking for clemency for Billy, one from the Bolton area running into thousands of signatures, and then another from his hometown which totaled over 7,000 signatures. None of these made a difference, and Billy was taken to Strangeways Prison, where he was hanged in March of 1926, with 50 people attending his hanging. Billy had murdered this 39-year-old woman, Frances Clarke, in cold blood. And Frances believed that she would never find love. She would never find someone to share the rest of her life with. And so when she met William and realised how much she loved him and married him, she knew that her life had turned around. This was really important to her, and she'd finally got the thing she'd always wanted. But Billy was determined to take that away from her. If he couldn't have her, no one could. Thank you so much to our guest writer for the help with this episode. They managed to find cases that I have never heard of. They're incredible stories that I think in some cases would otherwise be lost to the true crime podcasting and YouTube world. I've never heard of many of the cases they find, and you know I love to bring you cases that you've never heard before. Hopefully this is one of them. If you've got a case that you've never heard covered on a true crime channel before, let me know and I will try and get that researched. I am away for 2 weeks. I'm in hospital. It's nothing to worry about, but it does mean that I am going to be unable to upload episodes during that time. So I will see you in a couple of weeks for the next episode of Red Rum. Oh, and in the meantime, thank you so much for your case suggestions and for your film suggestions and book suggestions. To let you know, I have a giveaway coming up for one of my favourite books. So keep an eye out for that. Make sure you're following all our social medias. And in terms of film recommendations, I watched The Prestige recently, which I really enjoyed. It's a bit old. I think it's like maybe early 2000s, but I definitely recommend it. And I also would recommend a film that I saw that I'm a little bit late to. I mean, it's more recent. I think it's 2017 maybe, but I thought it was brilliant. It's highly disturbing and really grim, but it is definitely worth a watch. If you can stomach listening to me talk about these kinds of crimes that I talk about, I think you'd be okay watching this. I think, although I did still struggle towards the end. If you've not already seen it, it's Mother, starring Jennifer Lawrence. It's a Darren Aronofsky film. I think that's how you say his name. He did The Whale, he did Black Swan, and lots of other films that you probably would have heard of. So I highly recommend that. And as always, if you've got a recommendation, pop it down below. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.